You ever wonder what it takes to make hardened soldiers genuinely afraid? Not just cautious, not just careful, but truly, deeply terrified of a single weapon. Because here's something most people don't know. While history books talk about tanks, about bombers, about atomic weapons, there was something else on the battlefield, something the German soldiers learned to fear more than almost anything. Something that when they heard its sound, they knew someone wasn't going home. And the worst part? It was everywhere. On every vehicle, every tank, every plane. Impossible to escape. So, before we dive into this, you might want to settle in, maybe grab something to drink, because this story, it's going to take us through one of the most devastating weapons ever created. A weapon so effective that it's still in use today, more than a century after it was designed. And I'm going to tell you exactly why the Germans had nightmares about it. Stay with me until the end. You're going to want to hear this. And hey, if you find this interesting, hit that subscribe button because we've got more stories like this coming. Now, let's talk about the M2 Browning and the round it fired, the 50 caliber. The year is 1918. The First World War is grinding toward its brutal conclusion, and military commanders on all sides are learning hard lessons. Lessons written in blood and mud across the battlefields of Europe. And one of those lessons, one that would reshape warfare forever, was about firepower. See, up until that point, machine guns were firing the same ammunition as regular infantry rifles, 30 caliber rounds, effective against men, sure. But the battlefield was changing. New threats were emerging from the smoke and chaos. Armored vehicles, the first tanks, aircraft made of wood and fabric, but still dangerous. And the machine guns they had? They weren't cutting it anymore. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, he saw this problem clearly. He needed something with more punch, more power, something that could stop these new threats before they tore through his lines. So he put out a specific request, a demand, really. He wanted a machine gun that could fire a half-inch round, traveling at more than 2,700 feet per second. That request landed on the desk of one man, John Moses Browning. Now, if you know anything about firearms, that name should mean something to you. Browning wasn't just a gun designer, he was probably the most brilliant firearms inventor America has ever produced. The 1911 pistol? That's his. The Auto 5 shotgun? His. The bar? The M1919? All Browning designs. The man had a gift for understanding how to make weapons that actually worked, that soldiers could depend on. But this request, this was different. This was asking him to scale up everything he knew, to create something that had never existed before. So Browning took his M1917 machine gun, a water-cooled 30 caliber weapon that had proven reliable in the trenches, and he started making it bigger. Not just a little bigger, substantially bigger. He needed a whole new cartridge, something that could deliver the devastating power Pershing wanted. And this is where it gets interesting, because Browning and the ammunition designers, they didn't just make a bigger bullet. They studied captured German anti-tank rifle cartridges, the 13.2 millimeter rounds. They took the proven 30-06 cartridge design and scaled it up. They made sure it was rimless so it would feed smoothly through an automatic weapon. And after months of testing, calculations, trial and error, they created something new. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge, 50 BMG. 12.7 by 99 millimeters if you're using metric. They had no idea, none whatsoever, that they'd just created one of the most effective cartridges in military history, a round that would still be in service more than 100 years later. The first prototype was ready by 1921. They called it the M1921, a water-cooled heavy machine gun meant mostly for anti-aircraft defense. And on paper, it looked promising. In practice, well, that's where the problems showed up. First problem, weight. This thing was heavy. The water-cooled version weighed about 120 pounds. Even the lighter air-cooled model was 84 pounds. Add the tripod, another 44 pounds. You're looking at a complete setup weighing between 130 and 170 pounds, and that's before you count the ammunition, which wasn't exactly light either. Infantry couldn't carry it. You'd need multiple soldiers just to move the gun and keep it supplied. Small aircraft of the time couldn't handle the weight either. Early vehicles with small turrets had problems because the gun could only feed from the left side. The recoil was substantial, making accurate fire difficult. So at first, it looked like this weapon might not have much of a future. It could work as a coastal anti-aircraft gun, sure, but that was about it. A very expensive, very heavy solution looking for a problem. Then John Browning died in 1926, right there in his workshop in Belgium, working on yet another firearms design. But the work didn't stop. The military saw potential in this weapon, and development continued. Engineers refined the design. They changed the internal parts so the gun could feed from either the left or right side. You just had to switch the top cover. They developed a universal receiver that could accept different barrel types: water-cooled with its heavy jacket for sustained fire, heavy air-cooled for ground use, or light air-cooled for aircraft. These improvements changed everything. By the early 1930s, with these modifications complete, the gun received its official designation, the M2 Browning machine gun. Now, while the Americans were perfecting this .50 caliber weapon, other nations were going in a different direction. The Germans, the British, the Japanese, they were developing 20mm and 30mm cannons, bigger projectiles, explosive rounds. On paper, those seemed more powerful. But the American military, they believed in their .50 caliber. High velocity, high rate of fire for a heavy weapon, adaptable to multiple roles. They kept it in production, kept refining it. And they were about to be proven absolutely right, because a new war was coming. A war that would test every weapon, every vehicle, every tactical decision. And in that war, the M2 would become legendary. September 1939, Germany invades Poland and the Second World War begins. By the time the United States enters the conflict in December 1941, the M2 Browning is already serving in multiple roles across the American military. Soldiers started calling it different names. Ma Deuce was the most common, a combination of mother and deuce, meaning two, mother of machine guns. Some called it just the .50. But whatever name they used, they said it with respect, because this weapon, it changed everything about how they fought. Let me paint you a picture of how versatile this gun became. On aircraft, they installed lighter barrels and tuned up the rate of fire from the standard 450 to 500 rounds per minute up to 1,200 rounds per minute. Now, you might be thinking, that's about the same as the famous German MG-42. And you'd be right, except the M2 was firing rounds that delivered 5 to 10 times more energy per shot. Imagine that for a moment. And here's where it gets almost absurd. The B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, you've heard of it, right? In its G-model configuration, it carried 13 M2 Browning machine guns. 13! Mounted in twin configurations in various turrets around the aircraft. That's a flying fortress indeed. The P-47 Thunderbolt had 8 of them, 4 in each wing. But the Douglas A-26 Invader, this one took it to another level entirely. 18 M2 Browning machine guns. 8 in the nose, 4 in each wing, 2 in the turret. 18 .50 caliber machine guns on a single aircraft. Try to imagine being a German pilot seeing one of these coming at you, or being a German soldier on the ground when one of these aircraft decided to strafe your position. The .50 caliber immediately proved itself superior to lighter .30 caliber machine guns. It had the perfect balance, enough power to destroy engines, penetrate light armor, down enemy aircraft, but still a high enough rate of fire to be effective against fast-moving targets. And here's what made it truly terrifying for the Germans. It wasn't just on aircraft. Every American tank had at least one M2 mounted on it, usually on the turret where a soldier could operate it while standing on the engine deck. Every half-track, every armored car, many jeeps, they all had 50s. Think about that from the German perspective. Every vehicle you see has this weapon. Every low-flying aircraft might have a dozen of them. Everywhere you look on the battlefield, there's a 50 caliber waiting to tear you apart. This changed German tactics almost immediately. Dive bombers like the Stuka, which had been devastating in the early war, suddenly became much more vulnerable, because now every American position bristled with weapons that could shoot back effectively. Every attack from the air became a calculated risk, because small arms fire wasn't so small anymore when it's 50 caliber rounds coming up at you. By 1945, millions of M2 Brownings had been produced. Millions! It became the most produced machine gun in history. And the Germans, they were seeing them everywhere. Now, let me explain something about how this weapon actually works, because it's important to understand the engineering genius behind it. The M2 operates on what's called the short recoil principle. When you fire the weapon, the barrel and the bolt are locked together. They move backward as a single unit for about 10 millimeters. This keeps the cartridge case supported while the chamber pressure is still incredibly high. We're talking about forces that would rupture the case if it wasn't supported. After that short movement, the barrel stops. The bolt keeps going backward, extracting and ejecting the spent cartridge case. As it moves back, it compresses a recoil spring. That spring then pushes the bolt forward again, strips a new round from the disintegrating belt, chambers it, locks up with the barrel again, and fires. This cycle repeats for as long as the trigger is held down, hundreds of times per minute, each round delivering devastating energy downrange. Simple, reliable, effective. That's the Browning way. But let's talk about what really made the Germans hate this weapon. And I mean genuinely hate it, with a hatred born from experience and fear. First, there was the sheer firepower advantage. American doctrine increasingly relied on overwhelming firepower as a primary tactic. If you were a German soldier, you quickly learned that Americans never seemed to run out of ammunition. They would just pour fire into your position, and a significant portion of that fire came from 50 caliber machine guns. The range was another factor. See, the Germans had excellent machine guns. The MG-42 with its incredibly high rate of fire, the MG-34, these were superb weapons. But they fired 8mm Mauser rounds. Good rounds, effective, but they didn't have the reach of the 50 BMG. A 50 caliber could effectively engage targets at over 2,000 meters. That's more than a mile. You could be hit by accurate fire before your own weapons could effectively shoot back. And the penetration? Let me tell you about that. If you were fighting from inside a building, which German soldiers often were in urban combat, you learned very quickly that walls didn't protect you anymore. Concrete, brick, stone, a 50 caliber round would punch right through. And if the first round didn't penetrate, a sustained burst aimed at the same spot would collapse the entire wall section or shred your sandbag bunker into nothing. German tank crews had their own nightmares about the 50. Even well-armored tanks like the Panzer IV could have rounds slip through from the side or rear. Optics could be destroyed, tracks damaged, turrets jammed. Light-armored vehicles? They were death traps when a 50 opened up on them. In the Pacific theater, Japanese tanks, which had lighter armor, were routinely knocked out by M2 fire. There's one incident that stuck with me when I was researching this. American tankers in the Pacific encountered a Japanese banzai charge with tanks. Multiple Type 95 Hago light tanks came charging at the American position. The American tank crews opened up with everything they had, including their M2s. Those 50 caliber rounds tore through the Japanese tanks like they were made of paper. The crews inside never had a chance. Now, There's a myth about the 50 caliber that I need to address because it's been repeated so many times that people believe it's true. The myth says that the M2 was banned by the Geneva Conventions because of its devastating effect on the human body, that soldiers were told they could only shoot at equipment, not at enemy soldiers directly. This is completely false. There was never any such ban, no such restriction. But, and this is important, while the myth isn't true, the effect on the human body that spawned the myth, that was very, very real. You see, a 50 BMG round carries tremendous energy. When that energy transfers to a human body, the results are catastrophic. I can't describe the details here, you understand why, but think about what that round does to a brick wall, to a concrete barrier. Think about what it does to an engine block. Now imagine what it does to flesh and bone. German soldiers witnessed this effect. They saw what happened to their comrades when they were hit by 50 caliber fire, and they were terrified of it, absolutely terrified. This terror led to tactical changes. German infantry stopped making direct frontal assaults on American positions when they knew there were M2s present. Instead, they adapted. They would use snipers to try to take out the 50 caliber gunner. They would call in tank fire or artillery to destroy the position from a distance. They would use mortars, indirect fire, anything to avoid facing that weapon head-on. And here's what made it even more frustrating for the Germans. They didn't have anything equivalent. Their heaviest machine gun was the MG42 or MG34 mounted on the Lafette tripod. The Lafette was an ingenious mount, very stable, allowed for incredible accuracy and effective range, but the ammunition it fired, that 8mm Mauser, it just didn't have the power of the 50 BMG. The closest thing Germany had was a 13mm heavy machine gun, but it was used almost exclusively on aircraft. They never developed it into a ground-based weapon like the Americans did with the M2. There are records showing that the Germans planned to use captured M2s on their U-boats as anti-aircraft weapons when they had to surface to charge batteries. They even manufactured copies of 50 BMG ammunition for this purpose. That tells you something right there. They respected this weapon enough to try to use captured examples, but actual use was rare, mostly because capturing an M2 in working condition wasn't easy, and keeping it supplied with ammunition was even harder. Let me tell you about the different types of ammunition this weapon could fire, because that was part of what made it so versatile and so dangerous. The standard round was ball ammunition, full metal jacket, already devastating, but there were specialized variants that made the M2 even more effective. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate about an inch of hardened steel. Think about that, an inch of hardened steel. That's enough to go through the side armor of many vehicles. Incendiary rounds were designed to ignite flammable materials. Hit an aircraft's fuel tank with one of these, the fuel doesn't just leak, it ignites. Aircraft in World War II were especially vulnerable to this because they often didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks early in the war. Then they combined these features. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds would penetrate armor and then ignite whatever was inside. Armor-piercing incendiary tracer rounds added a visible tracer element so you could see where your rounds were going, adjust your fire. This was especially useful for anti-aircraft work or for long-range engagements where you needed to see the trajectory of your rounds. Gun crews would load their belts with a mix of these round types. Typically, every fifth round would be a tracer for ground use. For aircraft or anti-aircraft work, they'd load different combinations depending on the mission. More armor-piercing incendiaries for fighting enemy bombers, more tracers for dogfights, where seeing your rounds was crucial. After World War II, they developed even more sophisticated ammunition. The Raufoss multi-purpose round, for example. This thing combined everything into one cartridge. Tungsten penetrator core for armor-piercing capability, explosive charge, incendiary material, and it fragmented on impact. It basically behaved like a 20mm cannon shell, but in a 50 caliber package. And that brings me to something interesting. The 50 BMG cartridge impressed the American military so much that they built sniper rifles around it. There's a famous story from the Vietnam War. Carlos Hathcock, legendary Marine sniper with 93 confirmed kills. He wanted to engage targets at longer ranges than his standard sniper rifle could handle. So he took an M2 Browning machine gun, mounted a telescopic sight on it, and used it for long-range precision shooting. Single shots, not full auto, and it worked. He scored confirmed kills this way. This experimentation eventually led to the development of the M82 Barrett rifle, the famous anti-material sniper rifle chambered in 50 BMG. That weapon is still in service today, used by snipers around the world for long-range precision fire and for destroying equipment. Now, this video wouldn't be complete without talking about what happens when someone decides that one 50 caliber machine gun isn't enough. The answer? You take 4 of them and mount them on a single platform. This is the M45 Maxon mount, commonly called the Quad 50, and it's exactly what it sounds like. 4 M2 Browning machine guns, all mounted together, all firing at the same time. Originally designed for mobile defense against low-flying aircraft, the concept was simple. A single 50 caliber had good range and power, but a limited rate of fire. If you were trying to hit a fast-moving aircraft, you had only a brief window before the target was out of range. So they multiplied the rate of fire by 4. Every second, roughly 40 rounds were being fired. 40 50 caliber rounds every single second. The Germans had a similar concept with their quad 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, and those were devastatingly effective. But the German system was much heavier, specifically designed for anti-aircraft work and not easily moved. The Quad 50 was simpler, more versatile. It could be positioned on the ground on its own legs or mounted on vehicles like trucks or half-tracks. The electrically operated turret could traverse 360 degrees and elevate up to 90 degrees, letting the gunner quickly acquire and track aerial targets. The combined firepower of 4 M2s made it incredibly effective against aircraft. But here's where it gets interesting. As the war progressed and the Allies gained air superiority, they didn't need as many anti-aircraft weapons. German aircraft became rare in the skies over Allied-controlled territory. So someone had an idea. If 450s could tear apart aircraft, what would they do to ground targets? The answer was devastating. Quad 50s were turned on German infantry positions, on bunkers, on light vehicles. The effect was apocalyptic. Imagine being in a defensive position and suddenly 160 rounds per minute of 50 caliber ammunition start impacting around you. There's nowhere to hide. Walls crumble, sandbags disintegrate. Any vehicle short of a heavy tank is shredded. German soldiers who survived Quad 50 attacks talked about it after the war. They described it as one of the most terrifying weapons they faced. The sound alone was enough to break morale. That deep, thunderous hammering of 4 heavy machine guns firing in unison. The Quad 50 remained in service long after World War II ended. It saw action in Korea, in Vietnam. They even mounted them on trucks for convoy protection, creating mobile fire support that could respond to ambushes with overwhelming force. But let's talk about the human cost of operating these weapons, because that's a part of the story that often gets overlooked. If you were a 50 caliber gunner, especially on a vehicle or tank, you had serious firepower at your command. You could engage targets that other soldiers couldn't touch. You had range, you had power, you had the respect of your fellow soldiers. But you also had a target painted on your back. See, the enemy knew how dangerous you were. They knew that 50 caliber machine gun had to be silenced quickly or it would dominate the battlefield. So M2 gunners became priority targets. Snipers hunted them. Tank crews aimed at them first. Artillery spotters called in fire on their positions. And for the longest time, these gunners had almost no protection. On tanks, the 50 was mounted on the back of the turret, operated by a soldier standing on the engine deck. He was completely exposed from the waist up. On vehicles like half-tracks or trucks, same situation. The gunner stood there, fully exposed, operating the weapon. The distinctive sound of the M2 firing gave away the position immediately. The muzzle flash at night was like a beacon. The smoke from sustained fire marked the location. Within seconds of opening fire, every enemy soldier in the area knew exactly where that 50 caliber gunner was, and they did everything they could to kill him. For too long, gunner shields weren't standard equipment. Some units improvised their own protection, welding scrap metal around the gun position. But official shields didn't become standardized until much later, during the Vietnam War. Even then, early Humvees in more recent conflicts didn't have adequate protection for the gunner. It took terrible losses in Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers killed by snipers and IEDs while manning their 50s, before the military finally developed proper turrets and remote weapon stations. Modern remote weapon stations like the Krauss system finally solved this problem. Now the gunner operates the weapon from inside the vehicle using a joystick and camera system. They have thermal imaging, night vision, laser rangefinders. They're protected by the vehicle's armor while still having full control of the weapon. These systems can mount not just M2s, but also other machine guns and automatic grenade launchers. It only took about 80 years to figure out that maybe the gunner shouldn't be completely exposed to enemy fire. Better late than never, I suppose. You know what's really remarkable when you step back and look at the full picture? The M2 Browning, this weapon that wasn't looking particularly promising at first, became one of the most successful military weapons ever designed. Think about the timeline here. The design work began during World War I. John Browning started with concepts from 1918. The first prototype was tested in 1921. The finalized M2 entered service in the early 1930s. And here we are in 2025, and it's still in service, still being manufactured, still mounted on vehicles and aircraft and ships around the world. That's over a century of continuous service. The same basic design, the same core operating principle. Yes, there have been improvements. The M2A1 variant introduced a better barrel change system, added a flash suppressor, included a manual safety. But the fundamental weapon, it's the same one John Browning designed more than 100 years ago. Think about how much has changed in that time. We went from biplanes to jet fighters to stealth aircraft, from simple tanks to modern main battle tanks with composite armor and sophisticated fire control systems, from bolt-action rifles to assault rifles to smart weapons. Technology has advanced at an incredible pace. And yet, the M2 Browning remains relevant, remains effective, remains in demand. There's something profound about that. It speaks to the brilliance of the original design, yes, but it also speaks to the fundamental effectiveness of the 50 BMG cartridge. That combination of power, range, and rate of fire hit a sweet spot that nothing else has really improved upon for this role. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Put yourself in the boots of a German soldier in 1944. You're somewhere in France, maybe after D-Day, trying to hold back the Allied advance. You hear them before you see them. That distinctive sound, that deep, rhythmic hammering. Slower than the MG-42s you're used to, but somehow more ominous. Each shot sounds heavier, more substantial. You know what's making that sound. It's a 50 caliber, maybe more than one. You're in a defensive position, maybe behind a wall, maybe in a bunker. You think you're safe. The wall is thick, the bunker is reinforced. Your MG-42 gunner is ready, your rifle squad is in position. You've survived Allied attacks before. Then the first 50 caliber rounds start hitting your position. The wall you're hiding behind, it doesn't stop the rounds. They punch through, throwing concrete dust and fragments. Your gunner's position takes a direct hit. The sandbags explode into clouds of sand and torn fabric. Someone screams, but you can't hear it over the sound of the incoming fire. You try to return fire, but every time someone exposes themselves, the 50s concentrate on that position. Your squad leader tries to organize a response, but the fire is too intense, too accurate, coming from too far away for your weapons to effectively shoot back. And then you hear another sound. Aircraft engines. You look up and see American fighters coming in low. You know what's on those aircraft. More 50 caliber machine guns. Lots of them. This was the reality for German soldiers facing American forces. This was what they dealt with every day. Overwhelming firepower from weapons they couldn't match, couldn't counter effectively, couldn't escape. Is it any wonder they hated the 50 caliber? The M2 Browning represents something important in military history. It's not just a successful weapon design. It's a case study in getting the fundamentals right. John Browning understood something essential about machine guns. Reliability comes first. A weapon that works every time in every condition is worth more than a weapon that's more powerful but fails at critical moments. The M2 can operate in desert heat and Arctic cold. It can be submerged in water and still function. It can be buried in mud and sand, cleaned out, and keep firing. That reliability has saved countless lives. The 50 BMG cartridge itself was a stroke of genius. Powerful enough to be effective against a wide range of targets, but not so powerful that the weapon becomes impossible to control or too heavy to be practical. The ballistics are excellent, flat trajectory, good accuracy, effective at long range, and the cartridge is versatile enough that you can load it with different projectile types for different missions. The weapon's adaptability has been key to its longevity. The same basic gun works on aircraft, on vehicles, on ships, on ground mounts. You can tune the rate of fire for different applications. You can use different barrel weights. You can modify it for specific roles without changing the core design. This is why the M2 has outlasted so many other weapons. It wasn't designed for one specific purpose in one specific conflict. It was designed to be a flexible, reliable tool that could adapt to changing needs. And that's exactly what it became. When German soldiers talked about American weapons after the war, in interviews and memoirs, they often mentioned the M2. Not always by name, sometimes just the 50 caliber or the heavy machine gun. But the respect was always there, mixed with that fear. They acknowledged that American tactics relied heavily on firepower, and they often criticized this approach, claiming it showed a lack of tactical sophistication. But, and this is important, it worked. American forces advanced, German forces retreated. The overwhelming firepower doctrine, for all its critics, achieved its objectives, and the M2 Browning was a crucial part of that firepower advantage. German veterans would talk about the sound of American attacks. The artillery barrages, yes, those were terrifying. But then the tanks and vehicles would advance, and every single one had at least one 50 caliber. The combined effect of dozens of these weapons firing was something they never got used to. Some described it as a wall of fire, an unstoppable force that just kept coming. Looking at this story as a whole, what strikes me most is how a weapon that almost didn't make it past the prototype stage became one of the most important machine guns in military history. If things had gone slightly differently in the 1920s, if the military had decided the M2 was too heavy, too specialized, too expensive, if they'd canceled the program and gone in a different direction, World War II would have looked very different. American forces would have been at a significant disadvantage, lacking a heavy machine gun that could match their needs. But they kept faith in the design, kept refining it, kept it in production even when its future wasn't clear. And when war came, they had exactly the weapon they needed. John Browning never saw his M2 in combat. He died in 1926, before the final design was completed, before World War II, before it proved itself on battlefields around the world. But his legacy lives on every time an M2 is fired, every time a soldier depends on its reliability and power. The Germans hated the M2 Browning because it represented something they couldn't counter. It represented American industrial might, the ability to put devastating firepower on every vehicle, every aircraft. It represented a tactical approach that overwhelmed their defenses. It represented a weapon that was everywhere, inescapable, deadly. And more than 80 years after World War II ended, it's still out there, still serving, still effective, still representing the same principles of reliability, power, and adaptability that made it legendary in the first place. That's the real story of the M2 Browning. Not just a weapon that Germans feared, but a weapon that proved so successful, so fundamentally sound in its design, that it transcended its era and became timeless. So what's the final takeaway from this story? I think it's this. Sometimes getting the fundamentals right matters more than chasing the latest innovation. The Germans had more advanced technology in many areas during World War II. They had better tanks for much of the war, better aircraft in some roles, sophisticated weapons that were ahead of their time. But the Americans had the M2 Browning. Simple, reliable, powerful, adaptable. Not the most advanced weapon on the battlefield by any measure, but effective. Consistently, reliably effective. And in the end, effectiveness is what matters. Not sophistication, not innovation for its own sake. The question is simple. Does it work? Will it work in the desert? Will it work in the Arctic? Will it work when it's covered in mud, when it's been firing for hours, when everything else is falling apart around you? With the M2, the answer is yes. That's why the Germans hated it. That's why it's still in service today. That's why John Browning's design from over a century ago remains relevant in an age of smart weapons and advanced technology. Because sometimes reliability and effectiveness beat sophistication every time. If this kind of deep dive into military history is your thing, there's plenty more where this came from. Matter of fact, I've got a video about Red Ball Express hidden stories. You can check that out next by clicking up here, and I'll catch you over there.